Some time ago, Cooler Master released the MasterBox 600, which is their new entry budget level ATX case, for just $100 pre-tax and shipping. Although on the Cooler Master's website, they're selling it for $120, while Newegg is $100. So we'll just go with the lower one. Now, this is a fairly light and compact mid-tower case, which also supports the new back connect motherboards like Project Zero from MSI and BTF from ASUS. Speaking of which, my sponsors for this video here are Cooler Master for providing the MasterBox 600 case, along with some other accessories for an honest review, and MSI for providing the Z790 Project Zero motherboard so I can show the compatibility and testing. I must also mention that none of my sponsors have seen this video prior to the upload, and in this review I'll be going over the specs and features of the case, as well as the mounting capabilities and my overall thoughts and impressions for it. So let's start from the surface and dive our way into the internals. The MasterBox 600 does come in black or white, and honestly, strictly from a visual perspective to me, it does look like a simple and conventional entry-level case. The left side of the case is a tempered glass panel secured by a single thumb screw at the top with a pull tab to release. The glass panel is also designed to insert bottom first and basically fail-safe to prevent accidental drops when handling. This is really good actually. The top panel is where your power and reset button are, along with an audio jack and two USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 and USB-C 3.2 Gen 2x2. There's also a removable magnetic dust filter that goes on top. Right side panel is pretty simple, secured by two thumb screws and nothing more to cover your unskillful cable management. The bottom case feet are actually foam and not rubber. Foam I believe is going to be more cost effective to make, but at the same time the functional difference is that rubber will tend to grip whereas foam will tend to slide. The front panel is a breathable mesh with the logo stamped at the bottom and has gray vertical accents on the sides. This is true for both the black and white versions. Additionally, the front mesh panel is the dust filter itself, as you will not get a detachable dust filter that would traditionally slide or clip in and off of it. Now, while we're here, the MasterBox 600 does come with a total of 4 pre-installed RGB fans, 3 140s in the front and 1 120 at the rear. So the front panel does take both 120s and 140s, and the bottommost two fasteners are secured via these two long push-in fasteners instead of your conventional fan screws, which would be how every other screw on the front panel fans are secured from the backside of the front panel. I asked Cooler Master what this was about, and they told me it's to alleviate the inconvenience of having to reach under the PSU shroud to manually screw your bottom fan in. I also realized that when you take these out, you will need the assistance of tweezers to make things easier unless you want to break your fingernail. The cutouts for the push-in fasteners are also smaller in size than the rest of the mounting cutouts, so you won't be able to use the standard 7x32 fan screws. And when placing them back in, you will need to use tweezers again to squeeze the tip and push. They also mentioned that according to their own research, users typically prefer to keep the pre-installed fans in unless they are trying to upgrade their system, like enthusiasts trying to change some hardware around. But honestly, I don't think that accessing those two bottom screws manually by hand is all that hard. In fact, I'd much rather prefer it that way and work with the traditional fan screws instead of this workaround. But I do want to give props to Cooler Master for trying to make things easier though. But honestly, in my own opinion, I just don't think that this workaround is quite there. The most notable feature on the rear is going to be the PCIe slot covers, which require you to push and pluck with a screwdriver. This is definitely something an entry budget case would do. You'll have to be very careful with this, as pushing too hard can end up bending or damaging the PCIe slot frame itself, and you may have to bend it back straight. I'll talk more about this later. As for the main chamber, there is a PSU shroud that extends all the way to the front with a cutout enough to accommodate radiator placement and fans, as well as a small midway pass-through for the GPU power cable. The motherboard tray does have the cutouts for back-connected motherboards, as you can see, and the rubber grommets for cable pass-throughs are gray, but I wish they were the same color as the case, so it would be black here and white for the white case. And there is some room near the front allowing you to mount up to 3 2.5-inch SSD drives on the back side. Additionally, you can also mount another 2 SSDs directly behind the motherboard here. However, the package only supplies hardware enough for 2 SSDs, so I guess you'll have to buy more mounting hardware separately if you got more than 2. Under the PSU shroud, you do have the removable hard drive cage, which is also able to mount in one of two positions by securing with this one thumb screw. The PSU clearance is 170mm or 210 without the hard drive cage if you want a giant ATX power supply or simply just more room for your cables. Now, a note about moving the hard drive cage to the frontmost position. It will take away some clearance for the front panel if you are planning to stick a thick radiator up front. We'll get to that later. Then the hard drive cage itself is also capable of mounting one 2.5-inch SSD on top as well, which means this case can hold a total of up to 6 2.5-inch drives. Back to the front main chamber. The motherboard tray does support ATX and eATX with dimensions of up to 12 by 10.9 inches. Now keep in mind that eATX of this size will partially run over the cable grommets here, but it should still give you enough room to pass your cables through. Now I want to dive into radiators and fan support, but before I do that, I have to say that the MasterBox 600 is intended for an entry budget level case, which means that most people are going to be using this for air cooling and AIO liquid cooling. So I'll be using those as the prime examples first, but I'll touch upon custom water cooling later on in the video as well. Anyways, there is a height clearance of 170mm for air coolers, which would fit something as beefy as the Noctua NHD15 no problem. Top panel can mount a 360mm radiator with fans no problem as well. Now in the spec sheet, they do say that 280mm radiators are supported at the top panel. However, I found that very difficult to do. In fact, I was not successful at mounting a 280 up at the top because you just don't have the clearance for it. Now, most standard AIO radiators with fans attached are going to be around 52mm thick, meaning the radiator for AIOs is typically about 27mm thick and standard fans are 25, which will together get you at around 52mm thick. For this case to mount a 280 up at the top, you have to be under 48mm thick. That's what I measured before you run into the VRM heatsink on your motherboard. So what I tested, I think you need a very thin radiator or very thin or slim fans if you want to go with a 280 up at the top. And let me tell you, there are not a lot of options for thin, slim 280mm AIOs on the market. The front panel can hold up to a 360 or 420mm radiator, but only within these dimension limits shown on the screen. Now, I only have a couple 420 AIOs on hand, so this is what I'm using. Honestly, just stick with a 360mm AIO up at the top, set it with an exhaust configuration, and then keep the front panel fans to intake with cool fresh air. That's what I recommend, and that's what I would do anyways. Everything I just mentioned up until this point should cover the basics of using the MasterBox 600. But to touch up on a couple points earlier, I mentioned sliding the hard drive cage to the frontmost position will take away space for mounting a thicker radiator if that's your plan. However, this really only applies if you're trying to do custom water cooling, since that's really the only path where thicker radiators are available. Most AIO radiators are pretty slim, so you won't have much trouble with those if mounting on the front panel. As far as radiator thickness limits, we have to now dive into custom water cooling for that discussion. Now, keep in mind, I don't have every brand of hardware to test, so take what I have in this video as an example, but get measurements on your own for comparison if you need. I'm going to start talking about using single radiator loops and then move on to multi-radiator configs. As for 420 rads, I have a slim 30mm XR5 from Corsair, and that fits very easily up front. If Corsair had made the 420 in their thicker XR7 line, I'm confident it would fit with plenty of room for inside fans as well. Keep in mind the length of the 420 radiators is going to matter much more on the front panel mount. When using a 360, I was able to fit a 60mm thick radiator from AlphaCool, and you still have room to put standard 25mm thick fans on the inside as well. With the top panel, you can go as thick as 60mm 360 rad along with triple 120 fans, or if you plan on doing a 280 rad, then I recommend sticking to a slim sub 30mm or so, because once you add fans, you're going to run into your motherboard's VRM heatsinks, as mentioned earlier with AIOs. In fact, just trying this Corsair XR5 240 at 30mm thickness to line up on the 140mm mounts up on top, the fans don't clear the heatsinks. Additionally, when doing a full 360 rad up top, if you plan on routing your tubes down the back, you will have to remove your rear fan to get access for the run. The rear is also going to hold just a single 120 rad if you feel like getting every bit of cooling you possibly can in something like a triple radiator setup. Now, when it comes to running multi-radiator loop setup, you are not going to be able to fit dual 360 rads on the top and front panel with fans, even if they are slim radiators. My personal recommendation for most convenient installation and maximized cooling, just go with 120mm variation radiators across the board for easy wiggle room. Something like a 360 in front, 240 up top, and 120 in the rear if you want. With this being said, you can get a better idea of how to best mix and match for your setup. As for reservoirs and pumps, the only three sensible position would be the rear 120, where you can go with a flat style unit like the EK-FLT, or mount a cylindrical unit straight behind the radiator on the front panel, or have it mounted on the front panel itself in the absence of a radiator. The third option would be using a 3-in-1 CPU block pump and res combo like the EK Velocity 2. Now, a review isn't complete if there aren't any decent case comparisons mentioned. The one case easily off the top of my head, the Phanteks XT Pro Ultra, is a similar style looking case, mid-tower size, comes with 4 RGB fans pre-installed, and also back connect motherboard compatible, but comes in at $80 and the PCIe slot covers are not the flimsy push-out ones like the MasterBox 600. These are actually the normal replaceable slot covers. That's pretty hard to beat. But the MasterBox 600 also has some points over the XT Pro Ultra. It does have the PSU shroud cut out at the front to accommodate radiator placement, which makes it more custom water cooling friendly, as the XT Pro will only have space for fans up front. And it can also hold a total of up to 6 2.5-inch SSD drives versus the 5 on the XT Pro. Another thing I noticed is that the XT Pro has a cleaner looking motherboard tray, but that's also the reason why it can't hold as many 2.5-inch drives as the MasterBox 600. So I think in the scope with these two comparisons, it really comes down to what's more important to you. So in my example system here inside the MasterBox 600, I put a 14700K and a 4080 Super Founders Edition. Here are some quick benchmarks and some thermals. To be honest, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of people buying budget ATX cases and filling it up with 6 SSD drives, or even 5, let alone the 3.5-inch hard drive storage that's also available on both cases as well. And that's a whole lot of storage options in 2024, when everyone's basically on M.2s now and cutting cables that way. Now, without making this video longer, you can use the comparison between these two cases in my example as a grain of salt to help you figure out what features are important for you, especially when you are going to be looking at other cases in comparison as well. Now, lastly, I think at $100, I personally would take the Phanteks XT Pro Ultra over the MasterBox 600. I personally just can't do it with the push-out slot covers, the PCIe slot covers. But if the MasterBox was at $80, now it stands toe-to-toe with Phanteks in my opinion. But then you also have to keep in mind what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do custom water cooling, then I think the MasterBox 600 is going to provide more mounting options for you. But if you're trying to do air cooling or AIO, well, you can actually go either way. So that's my take on the MasterBox 600 for this video. All right, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.